Okay, so it's great. We're going to start off this afternoon with a panel discussion, which I think we've got about 45 minutes or so for. I'm going to come back to those questions that were banked this morning. So I know there's a couple down here. There's one over at the back, I think. But what I'm going to ask you to do is actually, when you ask your question, to broaden them out a little bit, if you could, if it's possible, the panel, or if it's a specific question, that's also fine. I'm actually going to kick off with a question that Melanie raised, which I then used in my opening remarks, about how well a company is doing at bringing the evidence that HTAs require. And can you sort of comment on, if you want to score it out of 10, or can you just comment on how well do you think companies are doing, and how much further do they need to go? And maybe if we can go all the way across the panelists. So who would like to take that to start off with? Thank you.
Do you hear me? Yes. Well, it's an excellent question. I think you have to keep in mind that HTA bodies are not the payers. So, of course, you have to meet the HTA requirement, but also the payer requirement. And that maybe can help you how to find the good way to have the better outcomes for your development. So I think the earliest is the better. And, of course, you could have two different directions. The first direction, you try to assess what is the expectation from the HTA body, official body, and then you have a submission to the official bodies for Europe, and my colleagues would be, I would say, more appropriate to answer your question. And then I would also recommend you to have some feedback from payers at the very early stage. So, for example, in France, that would be people working for the Social Security or for the Finance Ministry, and that are ex-member of the Economic Committee or people like that.
And so this is how to address the problem, and that makes perfect sense. But how would you rate how industry are currently doing? If you were to score them out of 10, would you think we're doing well, poorly?
I think there is a trend where in the old days they didn't care. And so it seems that now they are aware, and what I see, it's more and more joint regulatory and HTA payer boards, and so maybe there is a good trend. So I would say in the old days something like 2 out of 10, and now maybe 6, and I see a good trend, so maybe hopefully they would reach 8.
Yeah, a willingness to learn, right?
Yes.
So, Finn, could you comment?
Well, I think I'll skip this one, at least first, because I have no current practice to speak from.
Okay.
Well, I don't look at every decision that goes through NICE, so I can't quite give it marks out of 10, but my feeling is that the people in the UK companies have a really good grasp of what NICE needs, and a really good understanding of that. And sometimes we get very good submissions, and it's not just about having all the right evidence, it's also about having a price that you can support with that evidence. And you might have quite a good submission, but quite frankly, the person in the UK company was never going to come in with a good cost effectiveness, because the global decision on the price, and these things will always be global, was set at such a high level that they were always going to have a very difficult case to try and show they were cost effective. So I suppose maybe it's that feedback between local operating companies to global teams that and we also understand UK is not one of the most important markets in the world, so it's not that we'd expect that everything is immediately taken note of, but I sometimes think that the feedback just isn't heard quite often, and that's maybe why scientific advice has been more useful, because then the feedback is heard at a sort of higher sort of global level in the company. But undoubtedly, over the years that I've seen decisions go through, companies' ability to put in complex models and do good studies, it's undoubtedly improved immensely. So, but it's still about making sure that you can you can make your evidence and the price that all matches up in a good way, that you can prove cost effectiveness.
Thank you. Mira, how do you think we're doing?
I think that companies do well. And in most cases, they do try to do as good as possible. Except for companies who do deliberately wrong, and it is afterwards a catastrophic situation. And I can give you only one example. I've seen the company once, National Advice at AFSAPS, regulatory. We have seen the same company for the same development at EMA. The same development. We told them, please do not do this, please, because the endpoint that they have chosen is totally irrelevant. And they did. And then we saw the same company in Haas, and the product was absolutely not reimbursed. So these are the things that I don't understand. When the whole Europe says, please don't do this, and they do. But this is more exception than a rule. Because in many cases, you have companies trying really to do as good as they can. Sometimes the comparator is not the best one, but that's the boss deciding. It's not the guy who is trying to present his development. But I think it's not so bad. I'm rather satisfied.
Okay, so some generally positive views there. So I'm going to go to the audience now and kind of pick up some of those questions from the audience from earlier. Raj, would you like to go first? Can I have a microphone over here, please? And then we'll come to you there, and then we'll move back.
Okay, thank you, Mel. Rajesh Gupta from Celgene. So I have a question for all of the members on the panel. Do you believe there is a inherent conflict of interest in the needs of the regulatory bodies and the HTA bodies in terms of the evidence base that's required to make decisions which are going to be useful for both of those organizations, but also for the company? And if there is a conflict of interest, then what are those regulatory bodies doing and HTA bodies doing to resolve that in the new light of the joint advices we might be getting in the future?
Mira, can I ask you to pick that one up first?
I don't think there is a conflict of interest at all. I think there are supplementary additional points to take into account and additional data to put in the dossier for HTA.
I agree. I don't see a conflict of interest. It's a different perspective on usually the same data, and I think that if you think with both of those perspectives when you're designing your clinical program, I think it would be quite unusual if you weren't able to, optimize that program to go, reasonably to meet both the needs of, different people. There will be exceptions, obviously, in certain therapy areas, perhaps, but I've just been really surprised by the similarities rather than the differences, as my experience.
Can I just add to that as it goes round to Finn, coming back to Melanie's question about sort of convergence between HTAs and regulatory bodies, is it possible for ever these two decisions to become, completely sort of joined up at some point in the future, however long? So can you respond to that question and also comment on that as well, whether that's even a possibility, or are the two decisions so different that...
Very quickly, no. One is about safety and efficacy, and the other one's about, for NICE, it's about cost effectiveness. So you're answering different questions. So, one set of advice doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So I agree on these things. I think that there may have been a few examples that have been entertaining the debate for a couple of years, where it seemed that HTA people were sort of trying to remake or review the work that had been done by the regulatory people for the marketing authorization. But I mean, this is over, because on both sides you could say there is much more clarity on who does what for what. There's an overlap that is now going to grow, which is the vigilance field. EMA is emphasizing that vigilance is not just about risk, it's actually also vigilance on efficacy shown in trials into real life. We tend to call that effectiveness. They use both words, but basically it's about a vigilance to see whether there are some real-life effects reflecting the original decision. So I think this is an area that's going to, again, open for clarification on who does what, but the same data definitely will be of extreme usefulness for the HTAs. So if EMA as a body now can push for more developments in the field of vigilance, clinical databases, what kind of, all the kinds of things that could be reflecting real life, it's just going to be used for HTAs. Again, with two different purposes.
Thank you. Olivier.
No, I fully agree with my colleagues. I would just add two things. The first thing would be about the merge of a kind of European assessment for HTA bodies. So maybe in the long run, not in the short run, it may be the case for, I would say, both ethical, scientific, and maybe political reason. Because if you say that if you are eligible for a drug in Belgium, and not eligible in France, you could just cross the border and claim for the drug and go back to Belgium, then that raises a problem. So it's already a problem within, for example, Italy, where you could have denied access to care in Sicilia and not in Lombardy, and you have more and more litigation around this. And because of the new European rules, then if it is scientific based, you don't see why it wouldn't be allowed in one country and not in another. The second thing is that you may have a price within the range of the affordability of the country. So I don't say the price would be the same in Bulgaria and in Germany, for example, but if in Europe we think that we should have access to care in the same way, there is no reason to have separate body in the long run, but that is a very long target. And I think you can't compete with a request of patient and advocacy group and things like that. The second thing was about the payer expectation and not conflict of interest, but threshold of request. Because the EMA is willing to launch a drug that is clearly non-inferior and as safe as what is seen as non-inferior. So the question is that the payer are more willing to admit drugs that provide a benefit, and if not, they are happy to pay at the usual reference price, I would say. And therefore, they are willing to see comparative data, which EMEA don't bother. And as a consequence, there is here a kind of conflict of requests regarding the threshold where you have a positive outcomes. And sometimes companies or developers says, well, EMEA say they would like a placebo-controlled trial. And as a consequence, we have done a placebo-controlled trial, and it's why we don't have a head-to-head study. And the payer says, we don't care because we need the comparative data. And my answer, because you know, when I sat in the Transparency Committee, the head of the CHMP was in the committee too. So we have full information about what was the EMEA request. And it's not true that EMEA forbid to have three arms, placebo, active comparator, and the new drug. Never. And so when you say we were not able to do the trial because of EMEA, then you are in big trouble because someone from EMEA is sitting in the committee and says it was never our request. My last example would be about your drug in the patient pathway. Where are you? First line, second line, third line, which gives us the appropriate comparator, the appropriate backbone standard of care, if applicable. And so if you are not clear on the target, then for payer it's confusing because, of course, the cost efficiency model would be completely different. And for EMA, they don't care, because if you are as safe and as the same efficacy as what is available, they give you the market authorization, which is normal. So the idea is, I have a car and I can drive to Kiruna and I have only to stop in Copenhagen from Paris to refuel my car. Now you provide me a new car and I have just, let's say, a nicer light. I don't care. Now, if it's an electric car and I have to refuel every 50 kilometers, I don't care either. But if it's an electric car and I could go straight to Copenhagen, that is of some interest. That is an incremental medical benefit. So the question, what is the size of the improvement? Clearly, it is very important for both HTA and payers. And if you have only in mind the request from the EMA, then you don't address your problem.
Okay, thank you, Olivier. So bearing in mind Olivier's second comments, I'd like to go back to Mira. Apparently there is potentially some driver for sort of bringing, or at least sort of harmonising the decision because of the things that Olivier talked about. And I know that you mentioned from a personal perspective, you could see perhaps support more harmonisation. Do you think they could be more close interrelationships, having come from the regulatory background and now sitting in the sort of HTA space? Do you think these could be...
I'm not sure what your question is, because you speak about harmonizing decisions. We shall never harmonize decisions. Okay. So what is your question?
So that was the question. We will never harmonize decisions. That's
in fact, the aim is not to harmonize decisions.
Yeah.
The aim is to work on the same dossier or a similar dossier. We shall have a template for submitting a file for HTA in 1 year, maybe. The aim is to try to have a good methodological basis of assessment, and the aim is to have more or less clear ideas about what we want to have in the package when it comes from one side to marketing authorization and to the other side for HTA.
Okay.
And that's what we are doing.
Perfect, that's very clear. So can we have a question down here? Have we got a microphone? We have two questions here.
Thank you. Frank Zhang from Celgene Corporation as well. So my question is, actually, I think I heard a lot about understanding the payer needs in the whole morning session, which I completely agree. But from a company perspective, there are several ways of understanding the payer needs, right? So one is obviously the one that you presented, going through more of a I call it a more formal way of going through NICE and HAS scientific advice pathways. We know EGWIC, GBA also setting up ones. But then there's other ways, like, company can set up advisory boards, also understanding the payer need that way. So I guess my question for you is to get your take on, which way is better from your perspective, and maybe more of a pros and the cons of each ways, and what would be your advice to the company when they choose between these two pathways?
I think I have no vested interests here, so maybe I should. So actually, I thought about exactly this for a year or so. Why is there this exercise, and is it going to go on, or will eventually companies start to make their own mechanisms too? I think it's going to go on, because the reflection of if it's very good, well done work, I think the reflection of what is going on in the agencies is of importance. Now, if it was only about, having the template of what kind of information you really like to have, like what is the population, what would be considered to be the key outcomes, etc., etc. This could be done somewhere else. It could be done in boards for companies, etc. But I think both ways, and hopefully the companies, in fact, will develop internally mechanisms to get to grips with these things. Of course, because they also need, as several referred to, they need to reorient inside of the companies to much better understand what kind of data are needed, not just for regulatory. And of course the regulatory people inside of the companies, they are very scared about what is going on, like in any other situation when people feel they have been sitting on something and now it's being threatened by other processes. So I think again we should also seek maybe some audiences where we could have the scientific discussions about what is this about, what kind of data, what is actually realistically what we could ask for from companies.
I think, yeah, sorry, Sarah, did you want to comment on that?
I could just make a quick comment. Obviously, I am coming from a certain perspective. What companies have told me about the advantages of coming for scientific advice is that it forced them to all get together and decide and put something down on paper, and they found that very helpful. And I think maybe if you've got an advisory board, there's maybe not quite so much pressure. You're sort of saying, what do you think we should do, rather than putting proposals, which is what scientific advice is also about. And I think the other thing, I'm quite sure that there are many people in advisory boards that can really give a very close opinion of what say NICE would do. I'm sure that is the case, but so can most of the colleagues quite often in the UK company, and they don't get heard. So I think it's something about having formal advice from an agency. It maybe has more. It has more power internally, perhaps, to influence people, and that's what I've heard from people.
And it also forces the discipline of preparing for that engagement.
Yes.
And I have to say that from my experiences with these processes, it's the preparation and forcing the team to engage in that preparation internally that actually does almost as much good as the engagement itself. So I think I completely agree with those comments. You had a question, and then I'm going to go back to Simon at the back. So.
Thanks. Rastio Polcin, Tilos Pharma, Switzerland. I would like to have a question for the whole panel, in fact. And that's, we have heard that there will be no harmonization, it's not harmonization of the decisions, that's clear with regulatory bodies. But if you can comment as well the one step further, which is done in the process, which is the payers, in fact. Can we see somewhere in the future that we will have a joint meetings as well with the payers, they will join, or how they can, for example, I mean, accept your decision as HTA's bodies because you are advising on that. So that's one question, because we deal with the uncertainty in our business cases and evaluations, and then, I mean, with such differences across the Europe, across the systems, this is the problem, and each and every case, or the majority of the cases, have to be, in fact, killed. This is a general question, and one question for Sharon, then, if you can comment on these 22 companies on submissions. I don't want to give a Mel question, but I do believe it will be not a confidentiality breach, but if you can comment only on the proportion of big pharma companies and small size companies in that process, and more or less if it goes in majority about the new chemical entities, or even as well some, let's say, approval or drug formulation or reformulation and so on.
So the general question, first of all, was around involvement of payers in early advice. And I know we've seen that a bit in Tapestry, but also the impact of HTA decisions on payers. Was that? Would anyone like to sort of start off commenting on what's the impact of HTA on payers and how they're involved in the processes, or how they should be?
I shall begin, and Olivier may complete. For France, I can imagine involvement of the economic committee. This is something that is possible. I don't say that we do it or that we shall do it, but this is possible because we have good relationship with them, and they have they do well formalized requests of studies to be done, etc. But I cannot imagine 1 second this with national health insurance for some reimbursement things. I will tell you. If we have a co-diagnostic develop, test plus drug, for a drug, no problem. The assessment is done, the price is fixed, everything is fine. For a test, from the moment that we give positive opinion or guidance to National Health Insurance, they may put 1, 2, 3, 4 years to reimburse. And we can do nothing today. So there are things that we can imagine, and there are things that personally I can't. So Olivier, I don't know if you want to...
Please comment.
No, I would fully agree. That is very specific for France because we have device, we have process, and we have drugs, and you have hospital care. And for test, the test is done, performed by a provider, and the provider charge the patient. Is a fee, our system is funded on a fees for service basis. As a consequence, the price of the test, which is performed by a provider or medical provider, is negotiated by the trade union of the provider directly with the sick fund, which is very specific, where for drug the price is set up and negotiated by the economic committee directly with the company, which is completely different. And it's the reason why the framework, the legal framework is different. And your question is, are official payers willing to go into the HTA pre-assessment? Honestly, I strongly doubt. First, through the HTA, why not? As Mira stressed, that is really acceptable. But through a direct confrontation, I doubt, at least in France, because of the legal framework. And the reason is that they should not influence the HTA body. The HTA body release information that is used by the economic committee to negotiate the price, and there it's a black box. You know, it's like a Turkish bazaar. So they negotiate price. What do you offer? And so are payers willing to collaborate in order to set up a big European Turkish bazaar in the next few years? I would say yes. But then you are in big trouble because you would have a big organization that are willing to exchange tips. But nowadays they are quite reluctant to exchange their tips because they are happy on the way they do. It won't change that much for you because if you have a look to price in Europe, they are really in the same range, at least for the legal framework reason.
Thank you. Finn, can you comment, and then we'll...
Yeah, I think it's a very, very mixed picture across Europe. Some countries definitely don't have a single payer. They have health insurances, etc., etc. So I think this Turkish bazaar is actually well chosen because the culture in that area may very well be the negotiation culture simply, and nothing else. So there is also some work to do, and actually to try to bring the HTA information in an appropriate way. And some countries may have chosen the steps along the cost effectiveness ratio and the ISR and all that stuff, and that seems to solve everything. But in fact it doesn't solve, as we see now in the situation in UK. I'm speaking as a European analyst here, saying that it seems that what is going on is actually that there, even in this beautiful model, are some anomalies that needs to be addressed. So I think we'll just have to accept that these processes are deliberative processes, and we should make our information as good as possible into that. And again, it's talking for standardization where it's appropriate to standardize, that is handling the information and getting the information out of the data, and then the rest of the things we'll just see how they will develop. Hopefully they will take up the HTA increasingly, and I think the companies are going to press for that.
Thank you, Finn. Seren, and could you either comment on that or particularly address the second question, which was around the sort of proportion of companies of different types seeking advice?
I'll go to the second question.
Okay.
Yes, the companies that have done a lot of products with us have inevitably been the big companies, because it's them that have the large pipelines, and what we usually find is once they've done one project, that, you know, usually another team wants to come back with another one. So that's why they come through the door quite often. And they're often quite planned ahead, and actually they take a slot, and then sometimes they don't put the product in they initially intended, and they put a different one in instead. So they're very proactive that way. But certainly through the EMA HTA process, I've been doing some for much smaller companies, and you know, one was a sort of combination of existing drugs that were put together in a very novel way, and they were, you know, had to do quite a big development program for that. So, I think it possibly appeals if you're a smaller company. It's cheaper if you're not having a full written advice report, and also if you have no health economist in house, and you know, your questions are more around the clinical program, then probably inviting an HTA body to an EMA meeting is sort of easier to achieve, perhaps, than doing having the resources to do a lot of big separate meetings. But so yes, it's been a mix, and I think the number of smaller companies is growing, would be my feeling.
Okay. A linked question or comment from Ed?
Yeah, I just want to ask, MEDEV as an organization has had a goal to kind of have across payers have some collaboration. I did some consultation sessions that were experimenting with that as well. I don't know if Olivier or Finn can comment on that, how their role is expanding in that space. You know the organization I'm referring to, right? MEDEV, the one that Ad Schuurman is chairing. Which organization? MEDEV is European collaboration of payers to try and get together.
Could you repeat the question?
Well, we're talking about how payers versus HTA bodies are aligning their objectives, and I thought that MEDEV was an organization that was actually trying to get into that space, and I know at least a few years ago they started with some consultation sessions as well. I'm not sure how much they haven't had as much attention as UNETA, but it's another European organization. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. I knew they tried one consultation which didn't go so happily, as I understand it, but people want to comment?
So MEDEV is an informal organization. So as it is more to inform members of recent developments than to do specific actions. However, there was one specific action which was very important, and that is MEDEV's comments on EPARS. In fact, MEDEV has commented on EMA's EPARS for the first time in 2010 and have initiated procedure for revising EPARS. This was something. And then we did it together with EMA, with UNETA, and Stera, etc. So this is one thing. The second thing is that MEDEV will probably ask for a kind of improvement of SMPC, which will happen or not. But other than that, I'm not aware of specific actions. Because at all these meetings that I went for MEDEV, it was really for information, not more than that.
Okay.
Yes, as the chairman or current or former chairman, Ed Schuurman, always said, MEDEV is a forum for sharing confidential information. It's an informal forum of sharing confidential information. I can only say that because I've heard him say it in public so many times. I think that is something that, well, it's probably meeting some needs of the payers, but it's definitely not something that is sort of inside of what we're doing in UNETA, but probably some kind of coexistence is okay. Because obviously what is going on is that the payers would like as soon as possible to know what tendencies are the payers in other countries taking in relation to this or that drug. And this goes on now in some way in MEDEV, and it is linked up to one of the European payer organizations, ESIP.
Okay, thank you. So a question or comment from the back right.
Markus Ott, I'm coming from a bit of a different world, so medical devices, and we have completely different challenges. But one of the challenges and one of the things that are common is, for example, that we should take a societal perspective, or shouldn't we? Because there are countries that do take already this perspective, and NICE is going in that direction. But payer is only one perspective, and when you're doing an HTA, you do not have necessarily the payer's perspective. And then we all know that as well, within the life of technology, we do have so many different value chains involved. You know, there are the payers, it's only one. Then sometimes the value of technology is outside of the healthcare system. So, for example, that the insurance company, social insurance company, that somebody does not get invalid or you know, does not lose his job. So all these kind of benefits that sometimes technology provide are quite often not taken into a perspective. I think that is, especially for medical devices, of course, one of the things that are missing in an HTA evaluation. Not in the evaluation, but as well then in the decision.
Okay, so translating that, so basically, you know, what perspective should we be taking? How do we?
And the time horizon, that isn't interesting as well, because some of the benefits, you know, they're in again, you know, for implants. Talking about implants,
okay. So how do we sort of how do we understand the broader benefits that products can bring? And
well, I think it's very much at the side of the company. To as the device is being developed, to clarify where are the potential benefits and then quantify them. And sometimes it is budget impact, but sometimes it's more taking a societal perspective and then in some way played into the processes. I don't think it's only a matter of requirements from the HTA, because HTA would tend to have the broad approach. It's only when you squeeze and press the HTAs that they end up with only the first four of the 9 domains. If you have to do it within 90 days, you can't do a full societal economic evaluation, for example, or even go into patient aspects. So I think very much now it's on the side of the companies to start to develop how they can play into the field. It's very much asked for from the HTAs to have that kind of information.
I wouldn't necessarily say that. I wouldn't necessarily say that the companies are not prepared to do that, and we're emphasizing this all the time. You know, productivity loss due to some technology that provide here clear benefit. That is all emphasized by us as an industry, but it's not taking up. So it's not taking into account. Go to Germany, for example. If you do have the official opinion of a German evaluation, it says cost doesn't play a role. You know, so they're not really interested in cost effectiveness or the cost of a technology officially. You know, what we hear then on a hospital level, that's completely different. You know, so they are heavily interested in their budget impact, and sometimes they have to take the burden of the cost.
Okay, any further comments on that?
Observation that if you look at some of the big organizations in USA that are covering maybe tens of millions of people, from primary care to even something that may have to compensation if you lose your ability to work, they are moving in the direction of societal perspective, of course. But if you have silos, and you have a perspective in Germany which is very silo-oriented, of course they will only ask for budget impact. So there need to be some, I guess, political processes that will bring this more to the center to have a societal perspective where that's relevant.
How do you initiate that? Because that is, you know, the political level.
Well, from my understanding, from an HTA perspective, there is a. I mean, as Finn was saying, there is a broader willingness to understand a range of different perspectives. But it's more, maybe it's perhaps leveraging the core model more to try and sort of recognise some of these things. What do you think?
It's also different if it's at time of launch or time at reassessment. For example, at the National Health Authority in France, we have reassessed on a broad, holistic way growth hormone outside growth hormone insufficiency, and also Alzheimer's disease drugs. So it's not true that HTA bodies do not take in account the broad holistic picture, but it depends on the data the companies submit and the evidence we have. It's much more easier after a time the drug or the device is on the market to provide evidence about, for example, work productivity or not, because if it's at time of launch, most of the time it's more a speculation, and the question is also what is the evidence behind that.
Yeah, thank you. Last question, comment from Stephanie, and then I think we're having to close this panel. Have you got a microphone? You do. Great.
I'm interested in your perspective on HTA assessments on chronic diseases. We heard from Kantar, they took COPD as an example. That data payers may want to see is long-term data, reducing things that occur twice every 2 years to once every 2 years. That is data usually don't have at market authorization. So from a European point of view, how does that figure in the harmonization debate? And then maybe also from a country-specific point of view, how do you deal with surrogate endpoints, and where do you think this is going in perspective?
This may be one of the topics because, as you know, EMA is revising COPD guideline, and everybody is discussing if we do need modality in the for this or not. And I have no the slightest idea today of what we want, especially not in European level. I'm not even sure for France, you know. So your question is too broad today. But indeed, this can be one of diseases of interest to elaborate upon. So Seren, I don't know. Yes, but yes, Finn said we discussed about surrogates. Yes, we did the guideline on surrogates, but it will not help you to answer your question on COPD.
COPD, just as a specific example, I would agree, is probably quite difficult to make a strong health economic argument for, based on the type of trials that are currently done within the regulatory framework, certainly. But if you speak generally about, you know, chronic treatments, there are plenty of treatments that you can actually demonstrate, you know, important endpoints. So it's possibly more of a feature of COPD rather than just that it's a chronic disease. In terms of surrogates, well, they are important, but there aren't that many of them that we actually use. And you know, to have a surrogate, you've really got to get some very good data about how that surrogate does link to a long-term outcome. And it's not enough to say they correlate. You need to know that if you change, a change in that surrogate outcome also would equate to a change in that long-term outcome. And you know, that evidence isn't always there, which is why probably we don't use very many. You know, it's sort of LDL cholesterol and HbA1c really are the ones that I think we commonly use, but not many others. Probably some of the, you know, viral load type things. But yes, you know, a surrogate outcome at the end of the day is probably always going to be a bit more uncertain as well. So I think it's quite a lot of work to develop a surrogate. But I don't know whether that answers the question, other than saying, yes, COPD is quite difficult.
Further comments from Finn or Olivier?
Well, no, your question is interesting about surrogate, and I would say that HTA bodies and moreover payers have fear of surrogates, and especially we have had lots of bad experience, like for example for BMD in osteoporosis, you increase BMD but you don't hit the fracture outcomes as an example. So today we are in Berlin, so it would be tempting to answer as a Berliner, because for GBA, for example, you need a validation study if you have a surrogate. So I would say that that is a trend, okay for a surrogate, but then what would be our extrapolation from the surrogates to the real outcomes? So maybe in a new disease, an orphan disease, where you are nothing much to offer with very high unmet needs, at time of launch, a surrogate is acceptable. In an area of very high unmet needs, I think it may be acceptable. For an area like COPD, where you already have some drugs on the market, I don't see a surrogate acceptable in the short run, at least for payer, if not for HTA bodies, I'm afraid.
Okay, fantastic. So I know there are a couple more questions up the back, but unfortunately we've overrun this session a little bit. But I would like to say thank you very much to all the panel members for their responses. So. Thank you. So our next presentation is from Francis Arix. Francis Arix is the Secretary for